Hey there, students. So right now, the picture behind me, this is a picture of the Cameron House, which is where the women's suffrage movement, or its headquarters at, their headquarters was at in 1920. So the door that Violet and Myrtle just barely knocked on at the very end of the reading on Friday, that was the Cameron House, which is what you see right here in front of me. The door creaked open again. Chloe Mayhew's sister? The woman said. Yes, said Violet. Is she here? I need to talk with her. The woman frowned at Myrtle, and I'm Myrtle Davies. May we come in, please? Said Violet. She knew this was rude, but the woman's expression suggested she was going to still close the door in their faces, and Violet had been through too much for that. She wanted to see Chloe. Now. I suppose, said the woman, frowning at Myrtle. They stood in the entrance hall while the young woman hurried away, calling, Miss Paul. Miss Paul meant Alice Paul, Violet realized with a jolt as the famous woman came out to greet them. Violet had heard of Alice Paul. Flossie had read about her in the newspapers, about how she'd organized the nationwide fight for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, about the women picketing in front of the White House and being attacked by bystanders and soldiers, and finally being hauled off to jail. Flossie had made Violet read in the paper Miss Alice Paul's description of how she'd been force-fed by the jailers when she went on a hunger strike. Violet's throat had ached in sympathy for hours after she read it, even though that mother and father did not approve of suffragists like Miss Paul. And Chloe. Violet had been annoyed at Flossie for making her read it. She would rather not have known about something that had made her feel so uncomfortable. Miss Paul was a mild-looking, brown-haired woman of about 35. She smiled questioningly at Violet and Myrtle. Miss Mayhew's sister, she asked Violet. Violet nodded, not sure how you spoke to famous people. Her name's Violet, said Myrtle helpfully, and I'm Myrtle Davies. Goodness, you better come in and have some tea, said Miss Paul. Violet and Myrtle followed Miss Paul and the lady who'd come to the door, Miss Dexter, into the kitchen. Violet was conscious that her and Myrtle's shoes were tracking black train soot on the carpet. Your sister's been off campaigning for months, Miss Paul explained as she poured tea for them. Ever since the amendment passed Congress with the required two-thirds vote, she took off in that flivver of hers. The hope chest, Violet said, and then realized that she'd interrupted. I beg your pardon, Miss Paul. But now that she'd interrupted, she might as well get to the important part. Do you mean Chloe isn't here? No, she's in Tennessee, said Miss Paul. Violet felt herself sag with disappointment. Tennessee? Really? Yes, that's where it all comes down to, and so that's where Miss Mayhew is, Miss Paul smiled. She's a real fighter, your sister. She picketed the White House with us, and she went to jail. Jail? Said Violet, so surprised she forgot her disappointment for a moment. Chloe? Don't look so shocked, Violet, said Miss Paul. I've been to jail myself. I know, said Violet. I read about it in the papers. She was getting the hang of talking to famous people now. Miss Paul was very normal seeming and friendly. Not the New York Times, I hope, said Miss Paul, smiling. Well, yes, Violet admitted. My father made me read the one that said. Violet saw from Myrtle's expression that she didn't know what they were talking about, so she explained. The New York Times said that the women picketing the White House just proved that women were unsuited to vote because no man would ever dream of picketing the White House. She turned back to Miss Paul. My father liked that a lot when they said that. Hello! A woman with bright red hair came into the kitchen. Did I hear you talking about jail? I've been to jail 6 times. We might as well have some of those biscuits if we're having tea. Girls, this is Miss Lucy Burns, Miss Paul told Miss Burns the girls' names as she opened a packet of Unita biscuits. So your father liked the Times article, eh? A lot of people did. I didn't care for it much. She laughed. The Times has always been against us, but we've won New York anyway. Miss Paul looked at the map on the kitchen wall and sighed. Violet and Myrtle looked at the map too. Stars were penciled in on 35 of the 48 United States. 35 states had ratified the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. 36 were needed for the amendment to become part of the Constitution. If it did, then women would be able to vote in all 48 states, not just the 16 states that had already passed women's suffrage laws of their own. Now it all comes down to Tennessee, said Miss Paul. A lot of workers have been going there all summer. More are leaving in a few days. Miss Dexter's going. I had hoped to go too, but somebody's got to stay here and manage things on this end. Keep pressure on the president on both political parties and on Governor Cox and Senator Harding, the 2 presidential candidates. Myrtle got up and walked over to the map. She traced the states that didn't have stars with her finger. There were 13 of them. There are a lot of states here that could become number 36, Myrtle said. Why Tennessee? Tennessee has agreed to hold a special session of their legislature to continue to consider ratification, said Miss Dexter in a tone of voice that suggests she still hadn't forgiven Myrtle for being in the kitchen. North Carolina is holding a special session to take up a tax question, and they've decided to vote on ratification too. But we have a much stronger organization in Tennessee. Well, you're sure to get one, Violet said, looking at the long pink parallelogram of Tennessee, where Chloe was. The other 35 came so fast. She remembered how the first 35 states had ratified the amendment. Zip, 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 one after another, sometimes 2 in one day. She remembered Father and the Mr. R's grumbling about it at the dinner table, and Mother clucking her tongue over what this world was coming to. Miss Paul shook her head. It's not that simple, Violet. You see, we haven't just been winning states, we've been losing them too. She nodded at the map. While we were winning 35 states, the antis won 8. Antis? Said Myrtle. Antis are people who are opposed to women's suffrage, said Violet, like my parents. Violet looked from the tiny star of D.C. across the yellow Virginia to pink Tennessee and wondered how she was going to get there. That's right, said Miss Paul. So there are actually only 5 states still left in play, and if we win one of them, the amendment gets ratified. If the antis win all 5 of them, the amendment will be defeated, and that, she sighed, will be the end. But they won't win all 5, will they? Violet said. 3 of them are states the antis have always told us they expected to win, said Miss Paul. Florida, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Oh, said Violet. And Vermont and Connecticut have refused to hold special sessions, said Miss Paul. The governors of those states are antis, and the governor is the only one who calls a special session of the legislature into session. Violet thought this was starting to get confusing. But they'll vote on the amendment when they come back in their regular sessions, won't they? Maybe, said Miss Paul. There's a presidential election coming up in November, though, and I'd like to be able to vote in it. Myrtle stared at the map in fascination and drew a line with her finger from Washington, D.C. to Tennessee. Now, I really think the best thing to do with you girls is to put you in a bathtub. Don't you agree? Miss Dexter shot Miss Paul an angry look, but Miss Lucy Burns said, I do. Come along upstairs, girls. Myrtle and Violet were put into a spare bedroom once they were clean, and robed in Miss Paul's and Miss Burns's extra nightgowns. In spite of how big the house was, they were aware that an extremely heated discussion was going on downstairs in the kitchen. Violet strained her ears but couldn't catch what was being said. I wonder what they're arguing about, she said. Me, I expect, said Myrtle. Fine, don't listen to me. Miss Dexter's voice was suddenly clear. She must have stormed out of the kitchen and into the downstairs hall. I'm only saying that this is exactly the sort of gesture that loses us sympathy in the South. The front door of the Cameron house slammed. Violet wondered if Myrtle could be right. One of the many things that Violet had heard several times during her virtuous years of silence at the dinner table was that colored people were different. Yet in the last 24 hours of traveling with Myrtle, Violet had noticed that colored people were really not that different at all. She didn't mention this to Myrtle, who presumably already knew it, but to Violet this was something of a revelation. It was the first time that she'd discovered, all by herself, that Mother and Father were wrong about some things. Chloe had discovered it a long time ago and told Violet about it. But that was Chloe. For Chloe to be right when Mother and Father wrong wasn't that surprising. Violet had just never expected that she could be right too. Violet had always assumed that her own disagreements with Mother and Father were her fault, and that Mother and Father, particularly Father, were bound to be right, just by virtue of being Mother and Father. Yet clearly, they were wrong about colored people. Myrtle was no different than most of the girls Violet knew, except for the minor detail that when they started out on their journey, Myrtle's hair had been straight, but after she'd washed it under the faucet in the Louse home alley, it had turned crinkly. And except that Myrtle had been sent to a training institute instead of a school. Still, Myrtle was probably being too sensitive, Violet thought. Miss Dexter was probably upset about something else. Violet lay awake for a long time, wondering how she was ever going to find Chloe. Maybe the National Women's Party workers would take her to Tennessee with them. But she rolled over to ask Myrtle if she wanted to go too, but Myrtle had already gone to sleep. Chapter 7, Heading to Nashville. Thanks for listening.